Hey guys, Matt Gray, Cheltenham UK Philosophers. We obviously know that because you've probably clicked on a link that has those names. This is Metaphysical Idealism Part 2. It's a bit of an unusual talk today because it's obviously a talk on metaphysical idealism, but it's also sort of responding to a critique of metaphysical idealism as laid down by Matthew Acut. Matthew's done some poetry for the channel. I first met him in the Hermetic Idealist group, which I'm still a member of, and I think Matthew is as well. So that's quite interesting. That I met the guy in an idealist group, and Matthew's now writing a critique of idealism. So, it shows the flexibility of the Hermetic Idealism group. It allows people from all different points of view, and so on and so forth, and indeed allows for critiques of its own position, right? So that's cool. And equally, the same is true of Cheltenham UK Philosophers. We allow for all isms, all points of view. Some might regard some as mystical, some might regard some as overly rigorous and over scientistic. Some might, and that's cool, right? So this is my response to Matthew's critique. Just for the first thing to say is actually I really enjoyed reading the essay. I think Matthew writes really well. I think there's some great ideas in there. I think it's well written. I think in places it seems a little bit loaded by, what is obviously the conclusion. But then I suppose, writing is about persuasion as well as compulsion and reason. And so maybe that's the reason for that. I do disagree with some of the points made. I actually agree with a hell of a lot that's said. And obviously I disagree with the conclusion itself. And I say obviously, not because I came into it with a fixed position, but my position is largely unaltered, I think, by what I've read here. And I think that's probably not because what I've read is weak, but it's because my position is perhaps not as sort of committed as Matthew might think. But this isn't about my position on idealism. This is about what Matthew's encountered. And it's a critique, it's an argument against the idea that idealism is certainly true, right? I think that's the first thing to say is Matthew isn't saying that idealism is definitely wrong, but he's saying that it is wrong to assert that it's definitely true, right? And I think he's also suggesting that it isn't necessarily a preferable alternative to the other metaphysical systems, so such as materialism, physicalism. I don't think panpsychism is mentioned actually, but I think the claim is that idealism is no better an alternative than any of the others, and that I think it's also suggested. I'm going to get into the detail of it, and I'll explain how I'm approaching this as well. But I think it's really about so I think let's try and break this down. I think that there's an element of Matthew's work that is about the lack of explanatory power of idealism, right? So it's the fact that in spite of its claims, it still doesn't necessarily really explain anything, right? So I think that the argument there is that, well, it hasn't actually done a better job than any of the other isms, okay? And in fact, really, it's probably the case that the other isms, certainly materialism, has done a better job because it's the ontology of materialism seems to have delivered progress, knowledge, understanding of the universe and the way it ticks, and so on and so forth. So I think that's in there, and I think that's a really, really strong argument, right? And we'll have to get to that, right? And I suppose that I'll tell you what. Let's get to the material itself, because what I've done, I've made some notes on the work, right? So apologies for the sort of lack of structure of this, but I'm just going to go with it, right? So let's say So just to make my position clear, right, I think there is reason to prefer metaphysical idealism over the alternatives, right? I'm not saying that means that we should wave flags about it and, carve it into stone and say this is the final position. In fact, I think it is still an evolving position, right? But I'm just saying I still think it's preferable, right? And hopefully I can sort of flesh out why in this talk. That's certainly the objective. So let's kind of turn to some of the kind of paragraphs of interest to me in this work, right? So the very opening paragraph suggests that, so Matthew suggests, he says, idealism is often endorsed by way of reaction against materialism/physicalism, right? a thesis which is judged by many people as bankrupt when it comes to issues of qualia or qualia and the nature of consciousness. Right. So again, you can hear how well Matthew writes. Right. So it's a very enjoyable essay. I'd strongly recommend reading it. Right. But I think that that's true, but it's not just about a reaction to physicalism, because frankly, I think idealism was probably the default sort of metaphysical position for the many thousands of years which preceded the emergence of materialism is a very recent metaphysic, right? And yes, you can point to it and say, wow, look how successful it's been, right? Thinking of the universe in terms of like atoms and molecules and so on and so forth has given us planes, trains and automobiles, right? And, I grant that, right? So you might say, well, it's been the more successful kind of foundation of science, right? Or the sort of ontological foundation of science. And I don't think I can disagree with that. Yeah, I mean, I think, again, Matthew is very, very good at picking out some, real salient points here, and he's erected a strong case against idealism. But, and I think that's one of the strongest, the last few hundred years, we've seen such ridiculous advances, right? It's almost incomprehensible where we've come from. We've come from horse and cart, right? I've mentioned this in other talks that, certain technology has been around for thousands of years, right? And it is literally just in the last few hundred years since, materialist science has kind of really, really got to grips with nature, in inverted commas, and given us all these automations and so on, industrial progress. So it sure as hell looks like materialism is the way forward, right? And I grant that, right? But we just need to remember that, ancient texts, religious, mystical, philosophical, right, have been talking about this idea of the one mind, the all mind, fundamentality of consciousness for a hell of a long time, right? And it's not just based on reason or ideas, it's based on insight, visions and so on and so forth, right? Which I know that science doesn't like very much, but we'll get to that. But I agree with the idea. And again, so, Matthew suggests, he says, look, if we're going to adopt idealism as the preferred metaphysic, right, which he doesn't think we should, right, due to lack of evidence, we need evidence, right? And I agree with that, right? The other thing to say here is perhaps a little bit sort of nuanced, but I don't think idealism rejects materialist science, right? But it rejects materialist metaphysics. And that's a really important distinction to make at this stage, right? So to reject materialist science it would just be absurd, right? Because it's delivered so many results. We've got pistons now, yeah, and rocket ships and whatnot, right? And, you could say that that's because of the materialization of thinking and science, right? I think it's more to do with the just different levels of detail, right? So take earth, air, fire, and water, right? For a while, we considered these to be the fundamental sort of building blocks of nature, right? That doesn't work, that doesn't work in terms of explaining thermodynamics or steam or fire and so on and so forth. So we've come up with new systems, but we've got to remember that these systems and models are just that. They're refinements. And the predictive capability of them obviously improves, right? So that suggests there's something about the ontology behind these models that is preferable, but I deny that. And again, we'll touch on that soon. I think I also want to say at this point that actually I think that there is science, right? So okay, we've had sort of a few hundred years of materialistic science, right? Again, to be distinguished from materialistic metaphysics, but you could say that it's based on those materialist metaphysics, right? And it's delivered so much, but it's kind of stopped, right? So there's certain kind of boundary problems with science where, you take, for example, Planck's scale, right? So, and I'm not saying that Einsteinian physics are the only kinds of physics, right? And I'm also not saying they're necessarily materialistic because, again, sorry, I'm darting about a little bit here, but here's something to say that it doesn't really, in some sense, doing science doesn't really depend. To a degree, right? I'm saying to a degree, science doesn't depend on ontologies, right? I mean, a good scientific theory should always tell you what it's describing and give you some account of what these things are, right? But not necessarily, a working one doesn't necessarily have to. It's just we're still, whatever we're doing, we're only describing phenomena within the limits of human experience, right? So whether you're idealist or materialist or panpsychist or theist or pantheist, it doesn't matter, right? You can still find regularities in those observed phenomena, right? So, yeah, it's an interesting one. I think it does guide the type of science that you do. So we think, okay, there's a corpuscular kind of basis for reality. So let's let's look for smaller things, right? The reductionist program obviously pushed us in that direction. It's been very successful. But it doesn't mean that those small things we're observing or tell us anything about the fundamental nature of reality. Whereas I think idealism can, and I'll get to why in a bit later. So there's also this idea that actually science can support idealism. And I think that findings in contemporary science are beginning to smell like a kind of an idealist worldview, right? And discussed it elsewhere, and Matthew will probably have objections, but that's cool. I want to hear it through. And just another thing, while I'm going on with this, all of this, as far as I'm concerned, is being done in a friendly way, right? Ideas are ideas, yeah. And I sort of take it personally. Of course, you imbue and imbibe some of the metaphysics that you possess and espouse, but that's not the whole story, right? We still deal with this kind of naturalistic sort of world in which we can get things done, and we don't have to. I don't have to understand how gravity works to be able to put a mouse on the table, right? But yeah. Anyway, so I think that the likes of Carl Friston, Chris Fields, Nima Rakhania-Mer, Donald Hoffman, Mike Levin, maybe Wolfram. I think these guys are saying things which not necessarily overtly support, but they certainly deny a materialist account, right? So we're talking about things like space-time being emergent, matter not being a fundamental substance, but it's more of a property of space. We're talking about Mike Levin, through his research, discovering mind everywhere. In fact, one of his projects is called the Technological Approach to Mind Everywhere, right? So, so what that means is that they're finding agency, right? And maybe we need to talk about what that really means. I mean, agency seems to be about volition and all of these things that we normally associate with conscious beings, right? Now, obviously, materialist science, we've reached this sort of point where, we're extremely unmystical, and we're saying, well, no, everything just kind of plays out according to, laws of physics, no matter how weird and complex and frickin' freaky they might be, but, there's probably no free will, everything's sort of predetermined, unless you bring in some quantum fuzziness and so on and so forth. But, I don't think that the sort of science that these guys are doing really reinforces that. I mean, I think, Levin is finding evidence of cognition, basal cognition, inside frickin' sorting algorithms, right? So not even organic systems, right? So if the most basic stuff out there, right, seems to display agency, then mind's everywhere, right? And it's possible that we might be able to find more and more evidence, empirical evidence, right, to back that up. So what does materialism then say about that? I mean, this seems to be completely anti-materialistic, right? And idealism and panpsychism and some of the other isms would seem to lend themselves better to that kind of worldview, right? I think there's a couple of examples of sort of quite loaded wording, which is fair, as I say. This is about persuasion as well as logic, right? But things like sort of first we'll discuss the exact nature of idealism, briefly look over some of the reasons that might attract an honest intellectual to this particular worldview. It's like, well, and then the next sentence says, next we'll examine the various reasons which entice people to believe in idealism, right? I mean, this sort of sounds like they're being, lured into an alleyway to have drugs sold to them. And now, the thing is, I'd say that materialism is the weirder system. It's the weirder drug, right? Materialism, first of all, is a drug because we've been hooked on it for about sort of 300 or 400 years, or maybe 300 years, right? 250, I don't know. We've been hooked on it, and to such an extent that we've said some really weird things like everything is entirely predictable. Humans are machines. In fact, all life is mechanical. Evolution is an entirely random mutation process with no intelligence sitting in the overarching kind of evolving nature. Which is these are just massive metaphysical assumptions, right? But they've been reinforced by the sort of predictive and descriptive capability of this metaphysic, right? And I admit again, it has worked in terms of delivering planes, trains, and automobiles, right? So what's this then? So Matthew's also mentioned that purpose of this essay to show that although idealism cannot be conclusively disproved, there are no good reasons to think that such a thesis is true. I disagree with that. Like I say, I mean, I think materialism's hitting the boundary lines. Nima Akani Ahmed, for example, sort of abandoning the constraints of materialistic space-time to do high-energy physics maths, which is actually proving to be preferable to the the spatiotemporal maths, right? So some of the things that you get, as a sort of free miracle in materialism just don't work in the mathematics anymore. And well, they do, but it's far less efficient and accurate, right? So and also I don't think that idealists generally are saying that they're certain about it. Yeah, it's not a faith; it's a preferred model. It's a preferred metaphysic. And so far, I don't think I've seen anything that suggests otherwise, right? Oh yeah, this bit's really interesting, right? Because I think this. I mean, I might be confused here because, as I've declared elsewhere, I'm not a particularly great philosopher, and there might be a sort of semantic problem here. But Matthew has said that it's needful to acknowledge that whatever evidence we consider, it's all ultimately compatible with idealism and realism both. Because which point of view one presupposes radically reshapes the interpretation which is given to the various. Yeah, I think I understand this. But I mean, I just wanted to add. I mean, I don't think idealism is incompatible with realism, right? So, when I say that stuff is made of mind, there's still stuff there, it's still real, right? So the stuff that the impressions of the external world, or the representations of underlying phenomena or things in themselves, they're real representations of real things, yeah? So both the experiential sort of episode is a real episode, undeniably, and the fact that there is something there, giving that impression is probably undeniable. And you might want to talk to Philippe about this, but, again, a far better thinker that, has serious reservations about, well, it seems most metaphysics, actually. So I think this is an interesting one because I think that realism isn't incompatible. It's never incompatible with idealism. Yeah, you just change the nature of you toggle or reconfigure the contents of it to be made of a different stuff. That's all it is, right? So what is idealism? Yeah, I mean, I really love this paragraph. I just think it's really, really well written. Within modern philosophy, there's sometimes taken to be two fundamental conceptions of idealism: formal epistemological idealism, metaphysical one. Yeah, I agree with all that. And I'm in the kind of ontological sort of idealism camp, and I think that's the camp that is under the heaviest attack here. Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a really, really nice description. He describes the idea of the sort of cosmic mind, what Kastrup calls it, the mind at large. But again, I mean, I'm just pointing to Levin there. So the next thing, latter perspective, idealism can be thought of as asserting that existence and consciousness are coextensive. Yeah, I agree with that. Next sort of paragraph actually references an incoming essay from Matthew, which is entitled "The Thousand Ways of Knowing," right? Which sounds cool. And this is going to be about Donald Hoffman's interface theory of perception. So I'm really, really interested to hear about that because I find Hoffman very convincing, at least in terms of his building a fantastic model, which operates as a refined pointer, shall we say. So very, very keen to hear what Matthew thinks about this stuff. This is one. This is where I've got to mention Dawkins and some other bullshit, right? So I've got to read this paragraph because I think it's beautifully written, right? So why is idealism attractive, right? So in laying out the reasons that, remember this is Matthew Akut's words, right? In laying out the reasons that an individual might be drawn to the thesis of idealism, I will begin with those reasons that seem to me the most reasonable, and finish with those reasons that strike me as being particularly problematic or dubious. This should help to smooth out the transition between this section and the next, where this section focuses blah, blah, blah. Acknowledging the legitimate ground supporting idealism, the following consists in an attempt to breach idealism's epistemic defences. In this way, I aim to demonstrate that I appreciate why reasonable people find this ontological model so intoxicating a draft. I mean, I freaking love that. Right? I think it's a little bit loaded because it kind of, again, it makes idealists look like a bunch of sort of shuffling, junkies queuing up for their next fix. But again, I just want to respond to that by saying that I think materialism is more alluring and more intoxicating, right? Because it gives you the promise of planes, trains, and automobiles. It says, look, we've built these things, so the models that sit behind it must be true. and we're addicted to it. We're addicted to it to the extent that we're happy to send human beings, right, into mass sort of war against each other with machine guns and treat each other like machines. And yeah, sure, we've been fighting for millennia, right, but not to the extent and level of brutality and mechanized level that we have been since the prevalence of materialism, right? Look at Dawkins. Look at the absolutely ridiculous conclusions of Dawkins, who seems to hate philosophy and then writes a philosophy book called The God Delusion, right? Look at the crazy ass conclusions that he's coming up with, now obviously being disproved by the likes of Noble and Levin, right? And that's a materialistic, sort of metaphysic behind his thinking there, obviously, right? Sort of supposing that the world as we see it is exactly as it looks, and our descriptions of it will eventually get to a level of perfection based on this kind of materialistic model, right? So, and then what's this then? So perhaps the most direct justification for considering idealism is a recognition of the impossibility of direct knowledge, right? Right, okay, yeah, so epistemology, right. So I think that the limits of knowledge applying to epistemology apply to any other metaphysic or any other kind of philosophical traditional system, so I don't think idealism is any more exposed to that. So I think you can apply these constraints to any other position, right? But again, materialism is just failing, right? So Planck, amplitude, high energy physics, look, even Dawkins wasn't, even Darwin wasn't a Darwinist. Right? Even Darwin left some room in his thinking for the idea of some sort of intelligence in evolution itself, right, or in nature itself, that would allow for some of these sort of changed plans or changes of direction in morphology and so on and so forth to respond to emerging changes in the environment, right? And so what else have we got here? Everything that we know, everything we think we know is forever uncertain. Yeah, that applies to everything. It seems prudent to found our most general precepts upon something about which we could not possibly be mistaken. In this respect, idealism immediately strikes the mind as a simple solution, right? So the attractiveness of it, because consciousness is primary, and so the attractiveness of resolving the hard problem, right? I don't agree with that. The realization that everything we think we know is forever uncertain. That's probably kind of true, but I think it would be more accurate to say everything we know can actually get less uncertain, right? So, Chris Fields talked about this. He said, look, we might not be able to advance towards ultimate knowledge, but we can advance by understanding what isn't true and what isn't the case, right? So Wolfram's made some progress on this stuff with his Rouliad. The idea Hoffman's headset and interface theory point to this, the idea that perhaps it's possible to step outside of our constraints using either mathematics, well, in fact, in both of these cases, we're using mathematics. So this is where it gets a bit more emotive, and it sort of says, so Matthew says, in one grand gesture, idealism would seem not only to render the hard problem of consciousness a non-issue, but to satisfy the striving, right, intrinsic within the very nature of reason. I love that, right, for a unifying paradigm which coordinates our various precepts and concepts into a cohesive whole. That's brilliant, isn't it? Because there could be, I absolutely acknowledge there might be some psychological tendency to want some, like a baby saying, how does this work? How does that work? Why? We want some kind of parental endorsement or approval for some sort of model that explains everything. And that's, there probably is an emotional attachment to that, right? Okay, but maybe we should trust some of that attachment as well, right? So if we go for a more sort of idealistic interpretation of stuff, and we say, well, actually everything is mind, everything is kind of interacting through these kind of Markovian boundaries, exchanges of information and stuff. There's no space, time, or matter. They're just minds, right? Sort of embedded kind of, Markovian boundaries and stuff, right? It makes more room for stuff that is actually happening. Right, so stuff that actually even science is discovering is happening. So things like NDEs, some of the stories about psychedelics, where basically people's brain activity goes, almost next to zero, but they're still having the most profound experiences ever, and so on and so forth. Right. I think there is a striving, and that striving is part of what we are. Right. So I haven't proven it, but if the idealist interpretation is true, then we're all deeply interconnected. We're working together and striving towards some sort of novel preferable, which obviously invokes virtue and value and so on. But scenario, right? Talks about how, idealism allows for more esoteric and fluidic sort of ideas, so it's less rigid, and that's appealing somehow because it gives us more fluffiness. But I think, there's a striving, there should be. And I think that actually in terms of ethical considerations and interpretation of the nature of human beings, I think that idealism is probably the best way forward. So even if we're doing a kind of, what's it called? Come to me in a minute. Pascal's wager, right? Idealism would be the best choice to go for in a Pascal's wager because, if we go with the other ones, we end up killing each other with machines, right? Just think World War One. So one who feels affinity for these alternative modes of thought, therefore drawn to idealism because it promises an open door to revolutionary innovation. Right, so well. I like this. I love this paragraph. Elaborating upon this countercultural tendencies of recognition that scientific thinking tends to objectify human beings and their interests, reducing them a little more. So I love this. I think, there may be a mystic outpouring, but it doesn't stop the reason behind these ideas, right? So there might be a bunch of people that sort of, latch on and say, oh, yeah, this proves ghosts. But that's not the fault of the reasoning, the honest, as Matthew puts it, the honest reasoning idealist. We can't control that. Much as, hard-working quantum physicists can't control people turning their work into proof for, spirits or something, right? So how can we ever be sure if we've determined that knowledge has unassailable limits, how can we ever be sure that... Anyway, sorry, no, I've lost that a little bit. So, right, so this is an interesting one. So it's basically suggesting that idealism is more person-centered, right? So it's more sensitive, it's more forgiving to the individual, right? I'm not sure I agree with that. It's basically profiling idealists as kind of woo-ists, right? Again, I'd say materialism is more woo, because the conclusions of materialism, sure, again, we've got planes, trains and automobiles, but it also says basically we won't look at any data to do with psych research, we won't look at any data to do with UFOs, we won't look at any data to do with meditation or psychedelic. So materialism is more woo because it's basically turned the other cheek, so to speak, away from actual human real phenomena, right? We've become so invested in the map that we've totally forgotten that we are the fucking territory, right? So we've kind of like relegated ourselves to these kind of passive, irrelevant observers of this kind of physical system that has now taken precedence over human experience, which looks primal, is certainly the only thing we can deal with, right? So that's crazy, relegating us to these kind of, not non-entities within a physical system. It has to be person. And also there's this idea that, well, why shouldn't it be person-centered? It has to be person-centered because that's all we've freaking got access to, right? So we are those persons experiencing the world, in inverted commas. And so that's absolutely where it has to start. So I don't know what the problem there is. So what we got here? Although we can always doubt that the evidence we've collected is reliable, we cannot doubt that it is evidence of experience itself. The evidence of consciousness is thus questionable. Sort of agree with that, but we do the best we can. And again, I would suggest that, Levin, again, is finding examples of agency and cognition and stuff in systems that 10 years ago we would have just pushed someone out of the classroom if they'd said this, right? And he's got scientific evidence for this. Okay. Since consciousness is unquestionable, blah, 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 I'm not sure about that. Because there's obviously commentators that say, well, we don't think consciousness even exists, right? So Dennis and his illusionist people and so on. I take what you're saying, that we can't deny that we're having experience. So, echoes of Descartes there, of course. Right, so arguments against idealism. So Matthew talks about the idea that, idealists can say, oh, it's more parsimonious. And it is, right? But sort of suggesting that, given that consciousness is so complex, it's too complex to serve as a foundational principle, right? And so I suppose it's a fair criticism of idealism for not providing a definition of consciousness, maybe. But I suppose, talk to Kastrup and he'll probably give you one, right? But, in much the same way, this reminds me of Chomsky again. I think I go on to this later, that, Chomsky actually said once, he said that there is no materialist ontology because there's no satisfactory definition of matter, right? And there kind of isn't. And in order to have a entire metaphysic called materialism, you've got to define matter, right? Well, that's what Chomsky says, and he's much smarter than me. There's this thing. So, this is really good. So, due to being examples of consciousness ourselves, there's a certain intimate familiarity with which we typically assume makes us authorities on consciousness. But how does that authoritative position actually grant us insight into the nature of consciousness, except insofar as our self-consciousness has helped us to develop models which have allowed us to explain various aspects of the organism in which consciousness inheres? God, it's so well written. Well, again, I'm going to kind of like maybe I'll be called a mystic, but what about actually trusting nature, right? There is intelligence in nature, in the bushes and the bees and so on and so forth. And there's intelligence within the broad picture as well, right? So evolution itself displays intelligence, problem-solving intelligence of problems in morphology and development and so on and so forth, right? We are not devoid of telos, right? Dawkins would suggest we are, right? But, Levin's even developing approaches to being able to talk to these systems, right? And then, think about, so to take the hypnodermatologist, right? Who use completely unmaterialistic methods to heal someone's, horrendous eczema on their arm, sort of black necrotic tissue and so on. He literally just appealed to, the animal self or something during hypnosis and just said, heal that skin. And lo and behold, comes back a few weeks later with healed skin, right? So, what's going on there? If we haven't, the guy hasn't even touched it, right? I suppose you could suggest that you're just provoking the release of certain hormones and so on and so forth, and then, you could come up with some kind of extremely far-fetched materialistic explanation. But again, that's why I'm saying materialism is more far-fetched these days, because it just says, no, there can't be ghosts. Well, why is it that there's billions of people that have reported encounters of strange entities that they can't explain? Are they all lying? Are they all hallucinating? Well, I tend to trust human, experience a little bit more than some do, right? This problem with realism and idea. Again, I would assert that I'm a realist and an idealist. Everything is real, right? Stuff that is. I just deny that it's extensible spatiotemporal stuff, right? I've just said no, they don't here. I've just completely tried to contradict. Oh yeah, computers, automobiles, planes, guns, nuclear power. So this is where the kind of realist / materialist kind of scientific conventions are being celebrated because they've delivered so much stuff. And Matthew's saying all of this is possible because our models make contact with the nature of reality itself. I'm saying they don't. I don't think they do. And even if they did, those models are now failing. Right. So we've now got people like Chris Fields building quantum mechanic interpretations of the free energy principle that just don't assume the existence of space. They don't assume the existence of time. They don't assume the existence of matter, right? They literally strip away all the assumptions. And what you're left with could probably only fit an idealist ontology. It can't fit a materialist ontology because we've just literally just got rid of those things. And we can still do predictive modeling, right? Of those things that manifest as physical materials within our domain of experience, I grant, but that doesn't mean there's any physical stuff out there, in inverted commas, right? So what else have we got? Just something that Chris Fields once said. He was asked, can you imagine a universe with no minds in it? And he said, yeah, you can imagine it, but nothing would ever happen, right? So I think he either means that nothing would ever be perceived to happen, but I sense that he actually means nothing would ever happen at all. So happenings themselves are the results of agency, right? I don't want to get into the prime cause thing at the moment because that obviously assumes a kind of linear chronology that I don't necessarily want to assume at this stage. But so this idea of how is anything happening at all, right? And the kind of hardcore materialist would say, well, yeah, it's a self-organization of matter according to the laws of physics that eventually result in the complexity required for consciousness. I just think that's provably bullshit. But again, as Matthew keeps saying, that doesn't prove idealism, just disproves materialism. So we need to find separate evidence for idealism, and I grant that, right? I still think it's crazy confuting realism with physicalism. I mean, obviously the physicalists consider themselves realists because they think that that's what the real world is, right? But I think realism is something. I think realism is a denial of illusionism, right? And maybe even theism, perhaps more so than idealism. Okay, what have we got there? Yeah, there seems to be this argument. I mean, I think I agree that actually it doesn't really matter. You can carry on doing science, right, with or without an ontology, and whatever you believe this stuff is, you can carry on doing it if it shows regularity, right? But then again, I think if you stick to the materialist reductionist program, you'll end up making mistakes, as they are doing, and making crazy claims, right? So I think idealism actually shows us a way forward scientifically as well, and I think that's something that Matthew may, totally disagree with, but I'd be interested to hear why. So I think idealism kind of explains how there's any intelligence at all, because I don't think that intelligence and consciousness can be explained in a physicalist model. Again, reminding the listener that there is no definition of mind or consciousness. There is no materialism, really. Materialism isn't actually a legitimate metaphysic, because there is no definition of matter anywhere, right? What else have we got? Yeah, this is a sort of suggestion there's a kind of dishonesty within idealism or idealist thinkers. Yeah, there might be, but there's I think there's a hell of a lot more dishonesty, or at least confused thinking in materialism. I think it's quite brave being an idealist, because you're up against it. Because if you went into an interview for a university job, even these days, half of them would sort of smirk at you if you said you're a committed idealist. I think it's quite brave, some of these key thinkers coming out, and notice a lot of them do it when they're in tenure rather than teaching, because they might not keep their jobs, right? So we're not dishonest. We're we can see the limits of the existing mainstream views, and we think there's an alternative that actually seems more logical, which I still think it does. Get rid of space and time, blah blah blah. Free energy principle still works. What else have we got? So let's just sort of try and sort of summarize it, right? So I think that the main sort of evaluation of the critique is that idealism doesn't explain the universe. It substitutes one mystery for another. Also, it posits consciousness as foundational, but that seems too complex. And how can we use a complex as a metaphysical substance? We need to be more epistemically humble. Idealism, certainly push it. It suggests some crazy stuff, right? For the average listener, it still seems crazy to me, right? Donald Hoffman says this as well. He kind of, his science and philosophy tells him one thing, but his body tells him another, right? And we know why, because we're not designed to see the truth, right? We're not designed to understand the fundamental nature of reality, although for some reason we're now inquiring into it, so that might raise some questions about that, right? I think that this, Matthew's talking about the success of the existing paradigm, the prevailing paradigm, which is still materialism. It's been fantastic at delivering stuff, so that makes him think that it's closer to the truth. I just deny that completely. Something like Chinese room might come into that maybe, but definition, so idealism doesn't define consciousness. Well, nothing else does, right? If it's a fundamental, then it's an axiom, isn't it? So maybe that's the one free miracle, which is fine. At least we don't have 3 or 4 or 5 free miracles, right? It criticizes the idea that just saying that experience is primary is enough for us to assume that experience is everything, right? Well, it isn't enough, right? You need science, and I think that science is coming through, right? Again, Mike Levin and co. I think science, I think you can integrate idealism with science, and it will sort of open the door to much wilder seeming, but possibly closer to the truth sort of ideas. Again, amplitude and so on. It solves the hard problem of consciousness, because there is no hard problem if everything is made of consciousness. And also, finally, and then I think I'll leave this. It's been a bit long. Apologies for that, but it's the ethical implications, right? Idealism gives us a better ethical view. Some might claim that actually no, it's wrongly giving us this realm of certainty that it doesn't deserve because of the arguments within this and elsewhere, right? But okay, let's assume everything's wrong, right? And then think about which pair of slippers we'd rather wear. Would we rather have the pair of slippers that says, humans are just made of matter like absolutely everything else? Mind is a kind of epiphenomena of physical systems that doesn't give us any access to the reality, and there is no meaning, there's no telos, there's no purpose behind all of this. We're just randomly mutated, randomly evolved, randomly positioned, irrelevant little, organisms on a rock in space, right? So compare that view with the view that we are the cosmos. The intelligence and self-organization and the beauty of the unfolding world around us is evidence of that consciousness and intelligence, right? The world is kind of not just something we're in, it's our responsibility, and we're responsible for even bringing this stuff about, right? And by we, I mean, the one, the whole, and that of which we are a part. Again, something which modern science points to as well, right? I suppose the idea of the sort of cosmic consciousness, Mal, that kind of thing, it is vague, right? But it's going to be, because, we're only apes on a rock on space, and we're doing the best we can with extremely limited headsets, right? So it's going to be vague. But, Kastrup does deal with this to a degree when he talks about things like dissociation. He says, look, there's already evidence for this kind of dissociation because we can see it happening within single human minds, right, with this multiple personality thing. Yeah, so if a single human mind can be dissociated into, 7 to, 20, hundreds, I think, in some cases, sort of separate, agencies that think of themselves as separate, then why can't the mind at large do that, with sort of the whole of nature? I mean, it still has problems. It's like, well, where did this stuff come from? God knows, right? Quite literally. But I suppose my main response is I think science is actually peeling back some metaphysical layers, right? And I'm surprised at hearing myself say that because I didn't once think it was able to do that. But if science is making findings that suggest that there's mind everywhere, I think we need to take that very seriously and have a look at it and think about what that suggests about the fundamentals of nature. So I think that's it. Thanks for listening. Bye.